Hey, welcome everybody from around the country and the UK, where it's midnight. You're up late, and it's not too late in the UK. And so I'm Joe DePrisco. I'm the founder and the chair of New Literary Project, and we're so honored to be here today with Manuel Muñoz, who's the winner of the 2023 Joyce Carol Oates Prize, and Joyce Carol Oates herself. So we'll be talking in a little bit, but let me just tell you a little bit about Joyce Carol Oates. About the New Literary Project. New Literary Project is the home of the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. It's the home of Simpson and Starn writing workshops offered free teenage writers around the Bay Area. It's the home to Jack Hazard Fellows, who are creative writers who are full-time high school teachers who receive $5,000 summer fellowships so they can pursue their own writing. It's the home to Simpsonistas, Tales from New Literary Project, our annual anthology, which features writers like Joyce and Manuel, alongside many other distinguished writers and the distinguished younger writers from our workshops. So if you'd like to know more, please consult our TMI New Lit website, especially if you are Mackenzie Scott. So a few words about the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. It is not a prize for a book, but it's to a mid-career author, one who has emerged and is still emerging. And it's a $50,000 working prize insofar as the winner will be in brief residence in the fall at Cal and in the Bay Area, teaching and making public appearances. 36 writers were longlisted this year, and 270 writers over the years have been longlisted from 50 publishers. In addition to the prize recipient, Manuel, there were 4 other shortlisted finalists I'd like to call out, all distinguished and important and well worth reading writers, including Rabi Alameddine, Claire Beams, James Hanahan, and David Means. I want to register my thanks to some people who really made today possible. I want to thank Molly Young and Pat Rudebush from Orinda Books, Graywolf Press, especially Ethan Mazowski, Marissa Atkinson, and Claire Lane. Rare Bird Books, publisher of Simpsonistas and our publicist. The UC Berkeley English Department, the St. Mary's College of California MFA Creative Writing Program. And I also want to thank my colleagues on the impressive 2023 jury for the JCO Prize. Laura Kogan, Mark Danner, Donna Jones, and David Wood. And respect to my colleagues on the fabulous board of New Lit for judging and choosing the final recipient of the prize. Finally, thanks to all the generous donors without whom this prize and everything else we do would not be possible. And thanks too, especially for the dedicated creative leadership of Diane Del Signore, our executive director, and Vicky Chong, communications. Manuel Muñoz. As the 7th recipient of the prize, he succeeds previous JCO Prize winners, T. Geronimo Johnson, Anthony Mara, Layla Lalami, Daniel Mason, Danielle Evans, and Lauren Groff. He directs the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Arizona. His 4th work of fiction and most recent book is the wondrous collection of stories, The Consequences, published by the marvelous Graywolf Press, and edited with, in Manuel's words, big-hearted respect by Ethan Mazowski, and it has been met with profoundly enthusiastic reception. A little tidbit for today. We just found out that Compromisos, one of the stories in The Consequences, will be included in this year's Best American Short Stories. And this book ends the 3 O. Henry Prizes that Manuel has won in the past. As the JCO Prize recipient, he'll be in residence, as I said a second ago, at Cal in the Bay Area from October 2nd through October 8th. And details will be unveiled in due course. Joyce Carol Oates. Joyce Carol Oates is Joyce Carol Oates. In case you are unaware, her Substack is a wonderful way to stay current and enlightened. Her most recent books include the fascinating 48 Clues into the Disappearance of My Sister and Babysitter. Beautiful new novella, The Bicycle Accident, just came out in the New Yorker. Joyce is an honorary member of the New Lit Board. Warm welcome to you, Manuel in Tucson, and Joyce in Princeton. I'm in the Bay Area, where the Literary Project is based in Oakland, California. The three of us will have a conversation, and later on we'll take as many questions as we can. We'll at about 15 minutes from concluding. So if you don't mind, I think I'm going to begin with a question. Prize jury member Mark Danner said, called you, Manuel, the Chekhov of the Central Valley. Well, I always said that Chekhov was the Muñoz of Twilight Russia. So fair enough. So speaking of the Central Valley, where you grew up, your stories and the consequences take place in the 80s. So I'm wondering if you can say something about how you think the Central Valley has changed over time, if it has at all, and how your more recent visits there helped shape the consequences. I'm thinking particularly of the time you spent with your dad recently. And the biggest question, I suppose, is the Central Valley a kind of character in the consequences?
Well, first of all, thank you for today. Just this opportunity to be in the same room, albeit on Zoom with you, Joyce, is really an honor. And I've been nervous all day and excited, but also very proud of just notes that I've been getting from people about this acknowledgement and this prize. So thank you for giving me that feeling and this boost. Yeah, I write about the Central Valley almost exclusively, and I think it doesn't function necessarily as a character, but it does function as a place that will shape the characters whether they like it or not. I was born and raised there. I left when I was 18, but my entire family still lives there. And so I visit quite frequently. I see my brothers and sisters and my mom and dad very often, and with such frequency that I can see both how slowly the place is changing and also how quickly. It's a paradox. I think just like any other place, it's a paradox. It's a place of opposites and places of confusion and so forth. And I think that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating to me as a primary setting for the stories that I like to write.
But the time you spent with your dad helped you reorganize your stories to put it together for the consequences. Was there something generative that happened in the exchanges when you heard your dad's stories for maybe the first time?
Yeah, well, around 2015, I believe it was, my father had a stroke. And I went home to help my mom with the caretaking. And my mother's very much one of these people who feels like you have to be their bedside no matter what. And so I traded off with her every other night as we were helping my dad nurse back to health. And while he was there and he was sort of still battling with some sort of cognitive difficulties, he would let loose some stories that I had never heard before. And it sparked a certain kind of recognition, because sometimes I'd heard some version of those stories. Other times it felt like a contradiction. This is not what I had heard from some other time. And it became an opportunity for me to ask my mom about some of those instances in their lives in the 70s and the 80s, especially when they were dealing with my dad being deported back and forth from Mexico. And I guess maybe it was my naivete or my self-centeredness as a young person, where we just look at our own lives as the center of everything. And I never had really delved into the intimacy of those years for my parents when they were struggling to get my dad back from Mexico. So I started to learn a lot, and there were enough contradictions that I knew that I could shape them into stories as opposed to memoir.
Well, I can.
By the way,
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I have a correction here. So Molly of your In the Books corrects me to say the question should be put in the Q&A and not the chat. I apologize, Joyce. I apologize to you.
Oh, no, I just wanted to congratulate Manuel and hold the book up here. I thought it was very beautiful. And I just have a lot of different questions that are somewhat focused on craft because writers are interested in that. Well, I very often put together short story collections and I have a certain, it's sort of intuitive. It's not in chronological order of the writing, but some sort of trajectory of a narrative that's subtextual that you're sort of telling with the story. So I was wondering with your book, whether you did that, whether you consciously began with a story, like anyone can do it. And I think I know why you ended with what kind of fool am I? That seems like a natural ending. So would you just like to say a few words like for people who are writers about organizing a book like this?
Yeah, well, the consequences took me a long time to write. It took about 9 years, and I've spoken a lot about those 9 years being ones full of doubt and, to the point where I wasn't even really thinking about a book. I was thinking about individual stories and just to not sort of collapse myself with the idea of a project. But I guess I'm lucky in the sense that I tend to circle around very similar themes or very similar kinds of circumstances that lend themselves to an easy arrangement when it did come time to take myself seriously as the writer of this fourth book, to say, okay, it's no longer just a story here and there. There's a book involved. What does this mean? I started, I believe, with The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, which was the second story in the collection.
Yeah.
And it was a story that, my father's stroke had not yet happened, but I was thinking already about other kinds of family stories that my mother had shared, and just extrapolating from the smallest details that I thought were really important. That one came really from knowing that my mother had never gone past 3rd grade. And what did that mean for her as a person who was a US citizen born in this country, who just didn't have access to a K through 12 education? How did she manage? How did she survive? And again, rather than make it memoir or move into the realm of the true and the real, I felt there's something here about fiction. Who is this person? And I could find by daring to ask my mother some of those questions about those experiences, how the stories would get shaped. And the Happiest Girl came from just a moment being around the kitchen table when my mother does not like anybody using cell phones around the kitchen table while we're together. And while she was complaining about this, she was talking about modern conveniences like ATM cards, and that's when she let loose this plan that she had. Well, whenever your father got deported, we had this plan, which is duplicated in that story of meeting at a particular park in LA. If it didn't happen, you would go to the next park to find if fate would bring them back together, and it always did. But sooner or later, as these stories started to accumulate, I realized I'm writing about my neighborhood. I'm writing about my community. I'm writing about the various very difficult choices that people make in order to survive, and that became just sort of a hanging thread for so many of the stories and the characters, to allow me to hook stories together.
Well, I think there's a special energy and sort of a spiritual zealousness in writers who are either the children or grandchildren of immigrants. Like I am a grandchild of immigrants who came to New York State. And I think that there's just something about being so in awe and so admiring and kind of overwhelmed by their experiences. I mean, the fact that my grandparents who really had nothing. They were only about 18 years old and they didn't even know English, that they would make that journey across the ocean, which I would be afraid to do myself under those circumstances.
Mhm.
You know, not having any employment ahead, not having any identity. And I'm sure that I see the same sort of thing in Manuel, where there are all these rich stories and also very meritorious characters, people, like
Mhm.
really generous people that you want to commemorate. And it's a sort of different attitude from maybe a more blasé or metafiction, where the writer is very critical of his or her family, or her, you know, if you're from an affluent family, usually people are very critical and sarcastic and sort of
Mhm.
satirical. Whereas I think the children and grandchildren of immigrants have a different, it's a spiritual sensation of some kind.
Yeah, I agree.
Joe, you're like that too, aren't you, Joe?
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
I
yeah. My grandparents, Ellis
Yeah.
Island. That's right. Yeah.
Three of us, yeah.
but I agree with you in the sense of awe of those
It's
stories of
amazing.
how, you know, especially with those people in our lives who, being so young and so fearless and so brave, and then when they do relate those stories to us, leaving the mystery of some of the biggest mysteries are still, you know, they're still there for me. I know that there are stories that my parents haven't told me, and I can intuit somewhere in there that there's some work for me to do, that either for me creatively to fictionalize it, or to, you know, start another conversation where I can hear it and get the privilege of hearing it from them.
So, but at the same time, to follow up on Joyce's question, I mean, I know that Manuel, you're allergic to you're sensitive to the chart and the observation that you have lots of noble characters in your book, and I think you're conscious of how there's another thematic going on throughout.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I started the story with Anyone Can Do It, because when I had written The Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, and again, I've been very doubtful it goes out, and even though it had been picked up by a journal, it was by the late great Glimmer Train. I loved that journal. You know, I was still thinking about some old criticisms from way back then about, you know, noble characters, or them always on the lookout to do good. And so I said, well, I'm going to write the flip side of that. I'm going to write someone who is in a position to help somebody who decides not to do that. And so it became, you know, going back to the craft question, I was just looking for a mirror. Let me see if I could do the other side of the coin, not even thinking about them being in the same book or part of the same project, but what would it mean for me to shape a character like that? And how could they surprise me? And then thinking who, you know, where's the point of view? Do I tell the story via the person who commits the betrayal, or the person who's betrayed? And again, that just sort of kept me going story by story, step by step, as I thought about the people in my community.
So if you think about the first story in the book, Anyone Can Do It, published by the wonderful literary magazine Zigzagger, fantastic magazine everybody should know. The first line, her immediate concern was money. Well, it turns out the immediate concern stretches throughout this entire book. There's a complete, necessarily, I mean, people are poor. So, and then you have a character in Lise, I guess I should say, who's just as fascinating as Delphina. And Lise, spoiler alert, does something that's pretty contemptible. But when you were writing it, were you equally as fascinated with both these characters, or was it the boy in the story and the car? There were so many. I mean, the thing about your stories, Manuel, there are so many levels in every story. There's so many threads, and you tug on one thread and like a whole different story. Actually, the person who's not living in the house, the old man who surfaces later in Sisto, he becomes a presence. And it just reminds that for every absence, there's a missing presence.
Mhm.
Anyway.
Yeah, I guess that also comes from the storytelling prowess of my parents. They're so good at the stories around the kitchen table that even when they bring up somebody who sounds relatively minor, I can see a shape in my head of who they're talking about, whether they're, some sort of line that person has, tossed out, or some small but very significant thing that they did. And it has carried over, I think, into stories. When I was in graduate school, I worked on a novel. And I worked on a novel because I lived in a certain kind of fear of my cohort. My cohort was a very, very good one. They were all short story writers who had come into the program already published. So I didn't want to compete with them. I said, well, I'll work on a novel. And I wasn't sure that I was actually very good at what I was doing, but I was absorbing a lot of their conversations about stories and story making. And I think one of the things that started to cement was the sense that anyone who shows up in a story, no matter how small, was extraordinarily significant. And that's been, that's sort of cultivated for me a sense of paying attention to those details anytime they come in. So they do feel as if you take that one person out, like Geeky, the young boy in Anyone Can Do It, something essential has been lost by not including them. Which I think also comes back to a sense of community too. Everybody matters. Yeah.
You mean the son, Delfino's
Right.
son? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the story was very well crafted because her immediate concern was money, as Joe said. That sort of sets the tone. And then we're so sympathetic with Delfino, and we are very, very interested and kind of alert to the descriptions, which the setting is very vivid. And I appreciate that because I don't know the Central Valley. I don't really know these people, but the writing is so kind of measured and calm and thoughtful. There's nothing here that's magic realism that makes one, shrink away and wonder whether something's real or not. Everything seemed very real. It's like opening a door and stepping into this world. Then they go to a store, and the little boy, he's just really little. He steals a little car.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that's interesting. I mean, as a short story writer, I thought that's interesting. Like, why is he doing that? Why is Manuel having him do that? And then by the end of the story, it all came together in such a powerful way, and yet very subtle. It is very Chekhovian.
I will
There you
take
go.
Every story remains a mystery, because if I knew how to put one together in the truest sense, I would do it. I would do it every day. But there's such a struggle, and they are, sometimes they come fully formed, and sometimes they will really, really take their time. You mentioned earlier that it felt like a natural way to end the book with
Right.
What Kind of Fool Am I? And that story felt very much like it came in one piece, because I had been thinking about Bea, that's the sister in this story, for such a long time, that her movement on the page and within the parameters of what she does in the story, I never really had much pause to stop and reconsider or try to reconfigure what she was doing. And so that's what I love so much about stories and story making, is that if there were one way to do it, just one way to do it, it wouldn't be exciting, but it's a wonderful mystery.
Well, you have a very sensitive identification with women. I mean, the women characters are very strong and very believable and very vulnerable. The men are sort of different, and they're gay men, and that sensibility, and all of this is rendered so convincingly.
I'm grateful for that. I'll credit again my family, because I was raised by women to pay attention.
Yeah,
Pay attention. So
I can
I,
tell that.
I can't resist asking. So in the story, in the concluding story, on the full, you withheld Bea's name
Mhm.
for a very long time, such that I mean, I'm reading. I'm saying, "What's her name?" Was that was that some kind of unconscious decision, or how'd that happen? Because it was like
Um,
I got when I got the name, I said, "Okay, I know something more now."
well, I so rarely write in first person. And even though, I just said that the story felt like it was coming of its own piece, I didn't want to get in my own way. I thought it's first person, and this is precisely what she sounds like. And she doesn't need yet to announce who she is. Normally I write in third, and I write with a certain distance. I feel like I operate like a camera looking at the landscape and who might come into the picture and then exit. But first person is a little different, and it's scary for me, to be honest. I don't trust myself doing it. I think sometimes just for things like this, how does a first person character name themselves or show themselves or portray themselves when their primary duty in the story is to tell the story? There's so much that an I has to do. But in this case, I thought, just don't worry about those details, let them come around. And true, I know that there were some friends of mine who thought, when I read the story, I thought for a moment it was a male character, but it was really myself as a reader assuming, because it's you, that the I is male. And so when they discovered that it was in fact Bea and it's the sister, it didn't make me go back and introduce the name any earlier or make any kind of earlier connection. I thought that's okay. Let me leave the story where it wants to be, given this voice.
But it brings up a larger question for me, how that story ends and how maybe all the stories end in the consequences with a farewell, with a leave taking. There's a kind of valedictory mood. And maybe that's consistent with life in the Central Valley. And there's that where people are leaving, sometimes not by their own choice.
Yeah.
And you dramatize that so powerfully, so heartbreakingly. And the image that sticks for me is in the consequences, that story, where Mark is watching movies with his mom, and they're watching these Westerns, and he sees the stagecoach, or he watches the stagecoach trundle along the prairie, and he says, "Someone is always leaving."
Mm.
And that force throughout this story, throughout the entire book, is just knocks me out. You always feel that. Was this conscious, or did this come to you?
It is conscious. I think it's because I'm a big movie watcher, and reader, obviously, but sometimes when I think to myself, every story has been told or every image has been seen, I forgive myself and I forgive the great big world of art for saying there's a reason why things get repeated to us so often. I don't know when it was that I was watching the end of Shane. And, even years after I've seen the movie, I can still hear that little boy's voice calling for Shane as he takes off. And that loneliness or that despair or that calling out into the open space, it might be a completely different genre. It's a film, it's a different time, but it's applicable to the stories that I know I write. And I keep thinking to myself, people are saying goodbye. People need to leave some idea or some person, and why not try to duplicate what you've seen before, what you've heard before? Because isn't that what I'm really doing when I think about the stories that my parents have told me, and I'm in one way just sort of transcribing the reason they remembered in the first place. So that's part of it. I wish that I could have a little more levity. I'm trying to think of, watching more comedies and watching how those wrap up, whether it's a wedding or some kind of, happy sort of ending. But the sense of longing or the sense of closure that isn't really closure excites me. It moves me. And it's something that I see in the stories that I love very much.
Well, you're a realist writer, and so you're writing about real sociological and historical events. So it's a little hard to be, frivolous about them. Quoting from a beautiful story called Fieldwork, quote, "Work demanded everything of my family." And it was the same with my family too. So that the family is very, very important in these stories and in writing of this kind of, the migratory experience, people coming to a new place, establishing a kind of precarious existence, owning property and so forth. All these things that your characters are doing, it's very stressful, I think, even to read about it. So as we were saying about the first story, Anyone Can Do It, which really ends with a kind of catastrophe. I mean, the loss of something that it would cost so much, for a person who didn't have anything to lose something like this. It's like a murder, like the stories can turn upon small events in this Chekhovian way that have a momentum and ripple effects that is almost like melodrama, but it isn't melodrama.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of other instances in the stories where I've essentially done the same thing. And it's not, that I'm admitting to repeating myself. It's really more of a sense that it becomes a very useful pattern because, the existence of the characters or these lives demands it. It becomes, in one way, their lives are extremely expansive, but they hang on just the smallest thing, the smallest possession, the smallest decision that can turn into something quite momentous. With Bea at the end, I know why I ended the collection that way, because she has this sense at the end of the story where she could break away from family and sort of have her own life. But as I've said to a couple of people, we know that she reappears in another sense. And when we think about the longer chronology of a whole family history, do we ever really say goodbye? I don't think we do. And that motivates me again to keep thinking about how many stories I can actually contain in my neighborhood, in my community, even though the world keeps telling me this is very small, this is very limited. But I keep finding nooks and crannies.
This is probably as good a time as any to ask about the title, which has got me thinking often about what is Manuel doing here with this title. I know it's right. I'm tempted to ask, were there alternative titles? But I'm not going to ask that question. But I'm just wondering, it has a kind of theological veneer. It has a logical veneer. It has a dramatic sort of what it's the right word. So what is it about it for you? How did you land on the consequences and not consequences? The consequences.
The consequences. Thank you. Yes, because Amazon has it as with no.
Oh no. Down with it.
Well, it does come from the kinds of questions I've gotten over the years about why I write about aftermath, why I don't often depict particular events, but how people are dealing with them. What happens when something, as I just said, very momentous happens on something quite small. When the word came, when I was writing that story, I knew. I said, I don't want to say that this is what I've been writing toward, because again, I wasn't writing a book, but it was a moment that helped me break my doubt a little bit to say, you might struggle with stories, but they're serious in nature and they take on, pretty important dilemmas for people you care about. And that's what hangs in that word. There wasn't an alternative. And I've been through that battle with previous publishers about not being able to have the title that I thought was best for my work, but this was there, and I wasn't necessarily prepared to, you know, go to battle for it, but I just knew, I said, if it sounds right to me, a sharp editor will also know that it's the right title for this story, because I love the contradiction of how harsh the word sounds when I think so many of the stories are infused with love and care and compassion. And I love that paradox. So it felt perfect to me.
It's a particularly sensitive story, I think, because the person who loses a lover doesn't really love him while he has him, while he's alive. He realizes that he is in love with him after he's passed away.
Right.
And then he goes to be with his family and goes to the funeral. And it's very touching. It's very realistic again.
Yeah.
The story doesn't have, it just draws back from having like a really dramatic scene between the two when the one leaves the other and goes back home, I guess goes back home to die. And there isn't a climactic scene, you know, such as Edward Albee might have. But, it's so beautifully wrought.
Yeah, I mean, that the closest they got to that was the moment at the bus depot.
Yeah. And the mother has an interesting, a kind of triangular relationship too. Well, let me ask you a question that's more like literary. Mark Danner mentioned Chekhov, and I definitely had thought that too. Who are your influences and people that you really like to read?
Well, there are two that I bring up a lot, and I feel like a broken record on it, but they're important for various reasons. Edward P. Jones, I mention quite often because of his depiction of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Historically, not even just within a given time frame, but the way the city has changed over time, depending on who's come there, different parts of the neighborhood. I've always found him very inspiring, and also the way that his two collections of stories, the individual stories, build off each other.
Yeah, what's the title? I've forgotten the title of that.
Lost in the City.
Lost in the City. Yeah, it's a wonderful
great book. That's a great book.
Yeah.
It is.
And so those stories that, you know, the first in that one, and then the second in All Aunt Hagar's Children, Hagar's Children, I don't know exactly how to pronounce that name, biblical name, but they pair, and they pair in really intriguing ways. Sometimes it's absolutely the same character. Sometimes it's a very minor one that's, you know, spinning in their own realm. And the other writer who sort of does the same thing, but in a much different way, is Joan Silver. Ideas of Heaven, The Ring of Stories. But both of them offer me an opportunity to think about how I can shape a community, and how somebody who's, you know, just in passing can become the center, the star of the next piece if I needed to be. It helps me with my imagination when I'm feeling stuck and I don't know what the next story might be. I just start to think of somebody who was in the last one, who is there somebody in the draft that I didn't use who could be the star of the show. And so those writers have been very influential to me.
Very interesting. Well, I like books that are sort of have the heft of novels, but are comprised of short stories, like Winesburg, Ohio. It's like this is sort of the Central Valley, you know, like this community of people who know one another, but not really intimately. And then they post in and out of each other's stories. And of course, the great classic is Joyce's Dubliners, that sort of situation. And Joyce organized that material by having the boy in the first story being quite young. And I think he divides the stories up until, you know, children and adolescence and young adulthood, and finally the dead. So that's why I was asking if you had some, you know, principle of organization in your collection.
Yeah. I mean, that's go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Manuel, please.
No, I was thinking again about just in their individual stories, if I can bring up one of yours, Joyce, which is Four Summers.
Oh,
You know, for story, thinking about how place transforms, given a character's age as they move through a piece. You know, sometimes it's magical because they're quite young, but as they get a little bit older and they're aware of their own body or acne or trash, or suddenly the very same place has become quite different. And I remember
yeah.
encountering that story maybe in graduate school, and it was instructive for me in terms of place and then choosing the right character at the right time for the experience that's about to be on the page.
Yeah, there's no sorrow quite like the passage of time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You go back to the old house where your grandparents lived and somebody else is living there, and all these emotions come sweeping in. I guess there's nothing to do with these emotions except put them into a work of art and see if they connects in resonance with someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. Here's a question that I've thought about asking you. Even though there's no elements of magical realism exactly in your stories, there are some hallucinatory and ghost-like instances, as in what am I remembering? Oh, in Susto, there's a spectral presence in the field, and then I think Mark has a sort of spooky vision. So do you believe in ghosts, or do they just believe in you, Manuel?
Both. Luis Alberto Urrea told me a great story about having, well, I'm going to get it wrong, but something about having a dream, and he's asking the person in the dream, why am I dreaming about you? And they said, no, actually, we're dreaming about you, which I love. I love that reversal. So I remember when I was drafting that story and I was having difficulty with it. And I share my work with my editor in draft form, Stuart Bernstein. And I said something to him, I don't know why I'm writing a story like this. I don't write stories like this. And he said, the story in your very first book involves a devil who shows up at the dance. So yeah, you do. So I have, ghosts will make their appearances every once in a while. And I tend to use them as essentially as real, as kind of visitations of a kind. It's one moment with Mark where it's a Lazarus moment where he failed to call him out 3 times. He only called him twice.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's that's where I'll make some sort of connection like that, or sense that there's a way that those hauntings are really, those private emotions coming to visit somebody. It's not the first time, probably won't be the last time I'll do that. So do I believe in ghosts? Yes.
Well, it's certainly the case that people are haunted.
Yeah.
People are haunted, and in dreams, the dead appear in dreams to us, and they're obviously imprinted deeply within us. But when you encounter a ghost in a novel or a short story, you know that it has to be real in a palpable sense to somebody in the story, not to the writer necessarily, or to the reader. Mm-hmm. So it's a little more imaginative and flexible. It's if you're writing a memoir, you can't really put a ghost in it because people would say, "Oh, come on."
Yeah. Or maybe, I mean, who knows? I would buy it, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm going to encourage people to send in your questions. We'll be taking them in a couple of minutes. So please, in the Q&A, jump in there. That would be great. So
I could ask.
Go ahead, Joyce. I was going to ask another question, but go on, please.
Manuel, do you teach writing?
Yes, I do. I teach both graduate and undergraduate students at University of Arizona. Yeah, I've been in the MFA program. I've been teaching for 15 years.
Oh, wow.
So I got into academia a little late. I used to be in production. I was a production editor at Hachette in New York City before I got this teaching job. So the plan was not to be teaching.
But you were teaching high school at one point, correct?
Yeah, that was my first job out of college. Yeah, I taught right across the street from Harvard at Cambridge, Ringe and Latin. where I
Really?
met
Oh,
two,
interesting.
yeah.
So
I read-
private school. That was a private school?
No, it's a public school. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, public school, Cambridge
Yeah,
Public
Pat-
Schools.
Is that Patrick Ewing School? Did you go there? No, somebody went. Anyway, great basketball players.
Matt Damon and Ben Affleck went there.
I know, but famous
Yeah.
basketball players have been from there too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that closing image there of the novel, kind of full of my, when Bea she sees the light shimmering, all's beautifully rendered. It's so subtle, and she's made a tremendously hard choice, and we feel that, even though it's not articulated exactly. It doesn't have to be articulated, and it's held back. And so, when are we anxious for her? Are we enthralled by what she's doing? A little bit of both. And where did it leave you, Manuel, when you finished the story and finished the book? Because Bea becomes like, she's crucial now.
Yeah. Well, I used the word weighted, W-A-D, deliberately.
Yes.
Because it really felt like watching someone enter the ocean and into the deep waters, and the courage it takes. I'm very fearful of the ocean, so that's one of the reasons why the image meant so much to me, and why I wanted to render it that way, to a person who is working of their own accord and finally making a decision for themselves, being courageous and going forward. And I was exhilarated for her. But again, if we look at the entire trajectory of where she is, I mean, we know she's at the funeral. But the story of how she made it back isn't yet in the book. But at the end of this story, I hoped that I could leave it with just sort of a little bit of an uptick. So it's not my usual closing, but it's one, and I don't want it to necessarily be a hopeful closing either, but one that is exhilarating, and just watching somebody be brave in ways that I think some of the characters are able to be, others are not, depending on how you see them. Griselda, for example, of Happiest Girl in the Whole USA, I don't know if she's brave or not. I mean, she puts on a very brave face, but the moment when she's going back with her partner to the valley, having just helped this young woman, Natalia, but she has an opportunity to show an affection to her partner and rest her head on the shoulder, but she looks around and sees that, well, nobody else is doing that, so she doesn't do it either. And I don't, what's that?
I didn't understand that. I think I read that differently, or I misread it.
Yeah,
I thought that he was dependent, that the men are dependent on the women, and that his head would be on her shoulder rather than the other way.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, well, leaving it open, that way gives it room to be read in different ways. But when I was thinking about her, it's like, well, she has an opportunity to do this, but she doesn't do it. But I'm certainly not judging her. I like that she's left. She's left in a moment of kind of vulnerability, in the same way that Bea is at the end, when she makes a decision for herself. Oh, we lost Joe.
Oh. What, are you working on a new project?
I think I am going to this summer. Going back to that question of doubt, it's writing has been so difficult for me, but the reception to this book since I've been on tour in October has been so overwhelming and really wonderful and positive that it's given me a renewed sense of confidence that the stories matter, that the place matters, that people that I write about matter. So this summer, now that I've finished teaching and that the touring has calmed down a little bit, I'm excited to start some stories again.
So did you go through a time when you were having difficulty writing?
I was, it was around 2014, 2015, and it lasted for quite a long time. What broke it, I love telling this story. It's an editor at Edizione Black Coffee in Italy who had seen the story Susto in John Freeman's magazine, his journal. They were translating it into Italian, and she had not heard of me, had not encountered my work before, but got so excited by Susto that she got in touch with my agent and said, I would love to publish this book. But it was so early on that there was no book. But I love that she was so enthralled by Susto, and it gave me a good kick in the pants to sit back and say, okay, you might have doubts, but maybe other people don't, and see if you can work that into your advantage, into your favor, and put those doubts behind and keep working. And I'm hoping that the general conversation from all of these wonderful people in the past, both strangers and friends, and since October, can push me to keep writing and working on a next collection.
Well, when you go out with this book, what do you read?
I have read from every story in the book at one point or another. Compromisos actually turned out to be the last one. I resisted it for some reason, but when I was at UC Riverside a couple weeks ago, I finally decided to try it. But by and large, I read from What Kind of Fool Am I? And from Fieldwork. There's just something in the way that they sound when I read them aloud that I really take to. But I'm trying them all to see how they'll sound.
And are there any particular gay writers whom you admire?
Oh, there's lots. I mean, I want to say that I'd like to. It's a chance for me to thank David Ebershoff, because David Ebershoff was a really early favorite of mine when I was a graduate student in the 90s, and when it came time for me to publish my first book, my agent said, well, why don't you give me the name of 3 dream writers? Who would you like?
Oh, how nice.
And I said, well, David Ebershoff. I really admire David Ebershoff. And we reached out to him, and he wrote back and said, actually, rather than blurb, I think it would be better, especially because you're at a small press, you're at a university press, if I reviewed the book.
Oh,
And
nice.
it's a beautiful review. It was a full-page review in the LA Times. And so there are all sorts of reasons why David Ebershoff is a favorite.
I know David, not well in the sense that I see him very, very often, but he is a very good writer and a wonderful editor.
Yeah, and a very generous person.
Very generous person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's my internet went down. I guess I disappeared. Sorry. I apologize.
We noticed you were gone, but we tried not to say anything.
Well, I'm sure it was very enjoyable disappearance, right?
No.
And all the questions that I saw, there were a whole bunch of questions, and I can't access them anymore. But I do remember a few that I saw. Well, one was, Joan Sobel had my back. Patrick Ewing did go to Boston Latin. That's good. Good to know. Famous basketball player. And then there was a question about film, about movies. And you did talk about that a little bit, Manuel, about your romance with the movies. But maybe you can say a couple of words more.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Q&A now, and this is Edgardo, who's asking what the first entry into film watching was and what elements of film making inform the writing. For me, it's I've never thought about screenwriting, but I'm very attuned to visual directors and the fluidity when they move from one scene to another, because what it does for me is that it poses a great challenge to try to do the same thing on the page. And I think that's why I'm so detail-oriented or meticulous, or try to have a sort of measured way of describing a scene and to try to be as thorough as possible. some of that also has to do with reminding myself that many people have never been to the valley, and that they might be encountering the valley for the first time in one story. So that allows me to let go of the sense that, well, I'm going to repeat myself if I bring up a fruit orchard again, but there's so many details that I can bring up, whether it's the rustle of the leaves or the scent of the soil when it's being irrigated, or the time of day or the season. All sorts of things can change. And I picked that up, I think, also from cinema, especially when it's cinema that is showing the kinds of images that might be close to what I want to depict in my own. Doesn't happen often, but I see that.
There was another, as I say, all the questions have disappeared from me. Maybe you guys can see them. But there was a question about, well, what do you plan to do with your Joyce Carol Oates Prize? I mean, what's going to happen?
My mom needs a new roof, so I'm going to go halfers with my brother on a new roof for my mom's house. That's one of them. But yeah.
One of the best answers.
Yeah.
So what are and are you working on new projects now?
Yeah, we were just talking about.
I'm sorry, don't answer it again if you did that. Yeah.
Oh no, but just getting new motivation to come back to the stage, because I've said it but I'm taking it back. I thought for a long time Consequences was going to be the last book.
The last book?
The last book, yeah, because I thought this is very hard. And
really? What would you do? I'm shocked.
That's not in the agreement with this.
No. I mean,
you
because
can't
there's so much reading to do. My mind could still be occupied with words, but again, the doubt ran so deep for so long, and I wasn't comfortable with the sense that all books have very short arcs. It's not as if everyone's writing to go out and get fame and notoriety and attention, but we also don't want our books to be dismissed or to be disregarded. And I was sort of going through that with the last two, and I wasn't really game for coming up with that again. I think that's again why I wasn't working on a book. I was working on individual stories and not thinking about book publication. Just coming back to just loving the construction of one story and seeing what happens. But again, going back out and talking to people, different audiences, people who've encountered me for the first time, it's been very, very enlightening, and it's been such a supporting and supportive atmosphere that I feel okay. I'm game. I'm gonna try this one more time and see what happens.
That's wonderful. I'm sure Joe shares my sentiments. It's sort of shocking that you were thinking that this might be your last book. I mean, maybe it's just like the beginning of a whole surge or a whole wave of like new energy or something.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was about to turn 50, I went to have a drink with my colleague, Allison Hawthorne Deming, and she listened to me talk like this for a while, and she said, Manuel, you're talking like you're 70 years old.
Oh,
she said to me, think about all of your favorite writers and think about how many of them did their best work in the 50s. And so we had a wonderful drink, and she gave me a lot of ánimo and just encouragement, and in the sense that, your best years are coming, and make sure that you leave room to have that confidence come in. Well, I'm really grateful to be surrounded by people who have a lot of encouragement to give me. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, Joyce, go on.
Do you have a close friend, like a writer friend, to whom you show your work?
Oh, actually, no, I don't, because I'm a person who doesn't like to take anyone's time. I'll read the works of my friends, but I don't like to I don't like to sort of take too much of their attention away from their own work. I'll share it with, but I will share my trials and tribulations with them, so they'll know what I'm going through. I think that's why when this prize got announced, so many of my friends were very, very happy for me, and made me feel really great about it, and kind of told me, "I told you so."
I think we've discovered the only modest male writer that there is. I mean, most people are just the opposite of that. I'm joking. I mean,
no,
not really.
I don't. I mean, truly, my friends know I don't like to be the center of attention.
I
Even
feel the same way.
when the consequences came out, they were really pushing me. They said, "Manuel, it's been 11 years. Can we throw you a party?" And I was really resistant. I didn't want to do it. And again, I have to recognize that my friends want to celebrate me. They
totally understand, but your friends, you have to let your friends do something nice for you.
Yeah. Well, but they're here. I know they're here, and I know that they've been cheering me on and congratulating me with all the wonderful things that have happened because of this book. So I'm letting it happen. I am.
Well, I got to say, this is, you just articulated beautifully the rationale for the entire prize. Yes. This is when we throw a party for a mid-career author, which is the toughest time often for a writer. This is for somebody who's taking risks. I mean, everybody's afraid of, where they are on the list, and publishers cut people loose all the time. And we don't believe in that. This is your time. And that's what the Joyce Carol Oates Prize is all about. This is your time, mid-career. And this is your time to take chances. And that's our hope for the prize for all the writers that we've awarded. So a party for Manuel.
Yeah, I can't wait to do it. I am looking forward to spending time together in October and meeting lots of students and people who are celebrating writing, and hopefully specifically the short story. So
it's a wonderful venue, because I did that, and it's the wonderful people there, beginning with Joe and encompassing a whole society of great people in the Berkeley English department and elsewhere.
It's going to be fun. Well, I think our time is up, unless somebody wants to say something else.
Okay, well, farewell. Hold this up.
There it is.
I love the fact that I'm sure one of my friends is going to take a screenshot of Joyce Carol Oates holding up the consequences.
So modest. We've had a recent president of the United States who's the complete antithesis of modesty. It's just wonderful to discover somebody like this, and nice and sort of interesting cover design too.
Yeah, it goes back, I think, to the title story, and I know they read it because that's the moment, I think, where Mark is at the church and he sees the Bible quote, and the quote is, "You can be underneath my wings."
Oh, wow, I didn't even think of that.
I mean, that's the association I make with it. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
I'll just report, I'm seeing just an ocean of applause and hearts from the throng here today.
Oh, I see some hearts.
Yeah, look at all this. This is lovely.
Let's
talk for another hour.
I'm seeing them too. I will say just quickly, Joan Sobel, who is the one who confirmed Patrick Ewing's school, that's my very good colleague and mentor. And then just to answer Charlotte McCaffrey's question, it's Joan Silber, Silber.
B-E-R.
He's terrific. Joan Silber is sensational. Yeah. But Manuel, so are you. This has been a brilliant conversation. Joyce, fantastic. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you both. And let's do it again.
I can't wait to see y'all in October. Thank you so much for today. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's been great. Great conversation. Thank you.